All right, let's dive right into this explainer. Today we're unpacking a massive true crime thriller from the Old West, one that really exposes the bloody, highly capitalistic roots behind one of America's most famous outlaws. We always hear these mythical tales of gunslingers, right? But beneath the sheer legend of Billy the Kid lies a deeply complex, incredibly corrupt corporate conflict known as the Lincoln County War. I'll get every son of a bitch who helped kill John if it's the last thing I do. That visceral vow of revenge was sworn by a young Billy the Kid after his loyal boss was murdered in cold blood. And honestly, it's the emotional anchor for the absolute bloodbath we're about to explore. To a young orphaned outlaw who had spent his life bouncing between boarding houses and the wrong side of the law, his boss, an Englishman named John Tunstall, was one of the very few people who treated him with genuine respect. And Billy's vow? Well, it absolutely set the stage for an unprecedented wave of violence.
Which brings us to part one, the spark of war.
To really understand how this violence exploded, we have to look at the deeply corrupt corporate turf war that was completely choking 1870s New Mexico. I mean, this wasn't just a random shootout at the OK Corral. This was about money, monopolies, and absolute control. On one side, you had this ruthless, monopolistic machine known locally as the House, run by James Dolan and Lawrence Murphy. They controlled everything, from general store prices to incredibly lucrative military contracts at Fort Stanton, and they even had the local law, Sheriff William Brady, right in their pocket. On the other side were the wealthy upstarts, John Tunstall, a lawyer named Alexander McSween, and cattle baron John Chisholm. They were trying to break that stranglehold with their own competing store and bank. Basically, you had two massive capitalist forces on a direct collision course. And that underlying economic tension, it completely exploded in February of 1878. Using a disputed insurance policy as a flimsy excuse, the corrupt Sheriff Brady sent a posse of hired guns, which actually included notorious outlaws from the Jesse Evans gang, to seize John Tunstall's horses. But they didn't just take the horses, they caught Tunstall out in the open and brutally murdered him in cold blood. Billy the Kid and several other ranch hands witnessed the whole thing from afar, and just like that, the Lincoln County War officially began. Moving right into part two, vigilante justice. Tunstall's loyal ranch hands didn't just sit around mourning. They immediately organized for a devastating campaign of vigilante justice. But what makes this phase of the war so absolutely fascinating is the murky legality of it all. See, the crucial point here is that these men were actually legally deputized at first. A local justice of the peace appointed Tunstall's foreman, Dick Brewer, as a constable, and Brewer deputized his men, calling them the regulators. This severely blurred the line between lawmen and outlaws. They were riding out with legal warrants to arrest Tunstall's killers, sure, but their specific brand of justice usually ended in a whole lot of gunfire. And things spiraled into chaos incredibly fast. Within just weeks of Tunstall's death, the regulators hunted down several of his killers. Then, on April 1st, they escalated the war dramatically. Hiding behind an adobe wall near Tunstall's store, Billy the Kid and his fellow regulators launched a brazen, daylight assassination of the corrupt Sheriff Brady as he walked right down the main street of Lincoln. Naturally, the body count mounted rapidly on both sides. Just days after killing the sheriff, the regulators got into a massive shootout at Blazer's Mill with a heavily armed guy named Buckshot Roberts, which left both Roberts and the regulator leader, Dick Brewer, dead. In response to this crazy escalating violence, the territorial governor completely revoked the regulators' legal authority. Suddenly, they were stripped of their badges, officially branded as hunted fugitives, and locked in a desperate war for sheer survival. And that leads us to part three, the Siege of Lincoln. This mob war hit its absolute climax in July of 1878 during a grueling 5-day siege right in the middle of town. It was an incredibly tense standoff between the regulators, who were fortified inside the McSween home and a nearby store, and the Dolan faction's heavily armed cowboys surrounding them. And then, the sheer overwhelming force of the U.S. Army arrived. Commanded by Colonel Nathan Dudley, federal troops literally marched into Lincoln from Fort Stanton, complete with a Gatling gun and a howitzer. While they claimed they were just there to keep the peace, they pointed their artillery directly at the regulators' positions. This implicitly backed up the Dolan faction and forced Billy the Kid and his allies to consolidate entirely inside Alexander McSween's house. Trapped, completely surrounded, and desperate, the regulators somehow held their ground until the afternoon of July 19th. That's when Dolan's men crept up and literally set the McSween house ablaze. As the flames raged and thick smoke filled the rooms, the trapped men actually fought the fire from the inside, just waiting for nightfall so they could make a desperate break for their lives. The end of the siege was just absolute chaos. Susan McSween, Alexander's wife, was granted safe passage out of the burning inferno. But the moment the men finally rushed out the back door, the Dolan faction opened fire. Alexander McSween was gunned down right in the yard. Billy the Kid and a few others barely managed to flee through this total hail of bullets, escaping to the nearby river. The Battle of Lincoln was over. The House faction had won, which effectively ended the war but kicked off a brand new nightmare for the survivors. Let's look at Part 4, The Hunted. With the war lost, the surviving regulators scattered to the winds. But Billy, he couldn't outrun the warrants for his role in Sheriff Brady's assassination. Interestingly, he actually tried to find a legal way out. He met secretly with the newly appointed territorial governor, Lew Wallace, and agreed to testify in front of a grand jury against James Dolan in exchange for a full pardon. And Billy kept his word. He testified. But the local district attorney, who was totally allied with the Dolan faction, absolutely refused to drop the murder charges against him. Feeling totally betrayed and realizing the law would never actually protect him, Billy walked away from custody and fully embraced the life of an outlaw. After months of rustling cattle on the run, Billy's luck finally began to run out. There was a new sheriff in Lincoln County, Pat Garrett, and he was aggressively hunting down the remaining regulators. In December 1880, Garrett and his posse cornered Billy and his gang in a small, windowless rock house at Stinking Springs. Following a really tense standoff and a shootout that killed Billy's close friend Charlie Beaudry, a starving and freezing Billy the Kid finally surrendered. Billy was taken to trial, where he was swiftly convicted for the murder of Sheriff Brady. He was then transported back to the Lincoln Courthouse, which, ironically, used to be the Murphy-Dolan headquarters. There, he was placed under super heavy guard on the second floor, with his legs shackled and bolted directly to the floorboards, literally counting down the days until his date with the gallows. Which brings us to our final chapter, Part 5, The Final Escape and Demise. Now, Billy the Kid was absolutely not going to just wait around to be hanged. And that sets the stage for one of the most legendary action sequences in the entire history of the West, an escape that cemented his name in folklore forever. On April 28, 1881, while the brutal Deputy Bob Ollinger was across the street having dinner, Billy asked Deputy Bell to take him to the outhouse. On the way back up the stairs, Billy somehow managed to slip a hand free of his cuffs, grabbed a gun, and fatally shot Bell. He then broke into the sheriff's office, grabbed Ollinger's very own 10-gauge double-barreled shotgun, and waited right at the second-floor window. When Ollinger came running across the street to the sound of the gunshot, Billy looked down and famously said, "Hello, Bob," before pulling both triggers. Armed to the teeth and honestly completely unfazed, Billy really took his time. He stepped out onto the balcony, forced a local guy to bring him a pickaxe to break his leg irons, stole a horse, and rode out of town at a surprisingly leisurely pace. Just like that, he was a free man once again, a wanted fugitive disappearing into the rugged New Mexico landscape. We finally arrive at the climax of our story, about 2.5 months later, set in a pitch-black room at Fort Sumner. Sheriff Pat Garrett had been hearing rumors that Billy was still in the area visiting friends, so Garrett sneaks into the bedroom of wealthy landowner Pete Maxwell around midnight to ask about Billy, just sitting silently in the dark next to Maxwell's bed. Unbelievably, at that exact precise moment, Billy the Kid walked right into the house. He was just in his stocking feet, having sneaked in to cut a slice of meat from the kitchen. Spotting Garrett's deputies outside in the shadows, a totally startled Billy backed into Maxwell's dark bedroom, completely unaware that Garrett was sitting right there. Fluent in Spanish, Billy peered into the pitch blackness and asked this fateful question, "¿Quién es? Who is it?" Recognizing the young outlaw's voice instantly, Garrett didn't even hesitate. He drew his revolver and fired blindly into the dark. The shot struck Billy square in the chest, dropping him instantly. Without ever even seeing his shooter, the life of the 21-year-old fugitive came to a sudden, incredibly violent end, closing the book on the Lincoln County War's most famous combatant. So, as we wrap up this explainer, I really want to leave you with a provocative thought that might challenge some of those legendary myths you've always heard. When you peel back the dime novels and the Hollywood scripts, you find a young man caught up in a ruthless capitalist machine, where the law was literally bought and sold and loyalty was paid for in blood. Was he a cold-blooded killer or a tragic product of a deeply corrupt environment? Definitely something to think about the next time you hear the name Billy the Kid. Thanks for learning with us today.